May 7, 1945. In a commandeered German mansion near Frankfurt, a senior American general sat across the table from his superior, the supreme commander of the Allied forces. Germany had already surrendered, and the streets were alive with celebration as American soldiers reveled in victory. Yet the general did not share in the joy. He had come with a warning, one that would shake his career and fracture relationships within the military hierarchy. His message was simple but controversial. The true danger had only just begun. The enemy they had defeated was no longer the threat. A new, more formidable adversary loomed in the east, and, if left unchecked, it could challenge everything the Allies had fought for. The general spoke with urgency. He did not suggest continuing the war against the defeated Germans. Instead, his concern was the rising power to the east. He urged that immediate action was necessary while the American forces were at full strength and still capable of mounting an offensive. His superior looked at him, puzzled. After years of coordinating with Eastern allies to defeat the Nazis, the idea of turning arms against them seemed unthinkable. Public sentiment was firmly in favor of the alliance, and the media glorified these former allies as liberators. Yet the general's eyes were fixed on the strategic realities no one else wanted to confront. He had witnessed firsthand the occupation tactics of the Eastern forces, the brutality, the systematic repression, and the harsh treatment of local populations. Reports from intelligence officers confirmed the alarming observations. Entire regions were being subjugated, with civilians detained for perceived anti-ideological sympathies. Factories were dismantled and relocated, governments forcibly reshaped, and political opponents eliminated. The general saw patterns that were clear to him but invisible to the Washington establishment. This was not temporary cooperation. This was territorial expansion with a political agenda. He drafted plans for military action, leveraging the strength and readiness of American forces to counter the Eastern threat. His calculations were precise. The American army was fresh, well supplied, and at peak capacity, while the Eastern armies were exhausted from years of relentless fighting, stretched across thousands of miles of supply lines, and vulnerable to a rapid, decisive strike. He even proposed utilizing former enemy soldiers who were willing to resist the Eastern advance. Many of these soldiers would rather fight the Eastern forces than remain prisoners or face execution. While politically explosive, the plan made sense militarily. Yet Washington, still recovering from years of total war, recoiled. Public desire was for peace, not another conflict. Political leaders feared the optics and repercussions of antagonizing a new global power. The general's warnings were met with indifference, and he was labeled reckless, dangerously outspoken, and even unstable. Newspapers questioned his judgment, portraying his proposals as politically naive and socially disruptive. Behind the headlines, however, the intelligence he had gathered painted a stark reality. Eastern expansion was real, imminent, and systematic. Despite the lack of political support, the general continued his documentation, creating a record of the emerging threat for the American leadership. His reports outlined the occupation of Eastern territories, the imposition of authoritarian regimes, the eradication of opposition, and the growing power of a centralized military state. He predicted with remarkable accuracy that these actions would not remain isolated. They would spread, destabilize the balance of Europe, and eventually challenge Western powers militarily. He warned that delaying action would allow the Eastern forces to consolidate control, making any future intervention far more difficult and costly. His vision was not of immediate glory or personal ambition. It was a meticulous assessment based on observation, intelligence, and strategic reasoning. Yet his foresight came at a price. Political leaders, unwilling to act or publicly acknowledge the threat, began to marginalize him. He was removed from command, his authority curtailed, and his voice silenced in public forums. The general's warnings were ignored, dismissed as the ramblings of a wartime hero unable to adapt to peace. His removal symbolized the tension between military insight and political caution. The lesson, however, remained clear. The opportunity to confront the Eastern threat decisively in 1945 would be lost, and history would prove him right. Within a few short years, the territories he had identified would fall under permanent occupation. Authoritarian governments would rise, and the world would enter decades of geopolitical tension that could have been mitigated had his recommendations been followed. By mid-1945, the general's Third Army had penetrated deeper into German territory than any other Allied force. His troops had reached regions near the eastern border, and every town they entered revealed the reality of the occupying Eastern forces. Reports from intelligence officers detailed atrocities, the removal of factories, forced relocations, and the imposition of puppet regimes. The general understood something that politicians in Washington refused to acknowledge. The Eastern armies were not liberators. They were conquerors with a long-term expansionist agenda. He calculated the feasibility of a preemptive strike. The Eastern forces were exhausted after years of relentless combat. Their supply lines extended thousands of miles back to their home territory. Many of their soldiers were demoralized, motivated less by ideological loyalty and more by orders from above. In contrast, American forces were fresh, equipped with superior logistics, and backed by overwhelming air power. Tanks, infantry, and artillery were ready for deployment, and the morale of the troops was high. Even the remaining German units, though once enemies, could be persuaded to resist the Eastern advance if given proper leadership and incentives. In his assessment, a decisive campaign could succeed within weeks, striking before the Eastern armies consolidated their hold on Eastern Europe. Yet political realities were starkly different. Washington feared the consequences of antagonizing a new ally, and public opinion was firmly oriented toward peace after years of global conflict. Any offensive against the Eastern forces would have been portrayed as reckless, even treasonous in the context. The supreme commander of the Allied forces, though privately aware of the general's logic, rejected the plan. To act would risk destroying the coalition that had just defeated the Nazis, jeopardize the post-war order, and embroil the United States in another unpopular war. While military strategy supported swift action, political strategy demanded restraint. The general's frustration grew as he realized that his warnings were falling on deaf ears. He met with senior officers, shared intelligence, and detailed the vulnerabilities of the Eastern armies. Every argument he presented was sound, rooted in observation and historical precedent. Yet, policymakers were guided by diplomacy and negotiation rather than strategy and readiness. The general's worldview, forged in combat, clashed with the principles of coalition politics. Where he saw opportunity and urgency, others saw risk and controversy. His proposals were dismissed as dangerous fantasies, and he became increasingly isolated within the command structure. Despite the rejection of his plans, he continued documenting the situation meticulously. Letters to colleagues and reports to undersecretaries emphasized the threat posed by the Eastern forces. He described the systematic dismantling of opposition, the forced collectivization of resources, and the establishment of authoritarian governments across Eastern Europe. He foresaw the inevitability of a prolonged geopolitical struggle unless decisive action was taken immediately. While political leaders pursued diplomacy, he relied on the clarity of military logic. Strength in numbers, superior equipment, and morale advantage provided a narrow window of opportunity that would soon vanish. As months passed, the consequences of ignoring his warnings became evident. Territories once liberated from Nazi control were now firmly under the influence of the Eastern armies. Local populations were subjugated, dissent crushed, and political opponents eliminated. The general's predictions about the future spread of communism and authoritarianism in the region were unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. Every strategic assessment he had made, every calculation about the window Weakness and vulnerability of the Eastern forces was validated by the rapid changes on the ground. The world was entering a tense new era, one shaped not by foresight or preemptive action, but by political caution and delayed response. His removal from command further underscored the tension between military foresight and political prudence. Stripped of the authority to act, he was relegated to documenting events, observing developments, and warning policymakers who refused to confront reality. His voice, once commanding and decisive on the battlefield, was now constrained by protocol and politics. Even as the situation he had predicted materialized, he could only record it, powerless to intervene. Yet his observations remained a critical record of strategic insight ignored, a blueprint of what could have been done to alter the course of history. The lessons of this period were clear. Military insight and political decision-making often operate on different timelines. Opportunities for decisive action can be fleeting, and waiting for consensus or approval can render even the most well-founded strategies impossible. The general's foresight, grounded in intelligence and battlefield experience, highlighted the risks of delaying action against a determined and expanding adversary. History would ultimately validate his warnings, proving that the window for strategic intervention had been tragically missed. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, the consequences of inaction became increasingly apparent. Eastern armies consolidated their control over occupied territories, systematically installing compliant regimes and eliminating resistance. Entire populations were subjected to forced labor, ideological indoctrination, and suppression of dissent. The general had foreseen this. His intelligence reports had detailed the methods and motivations of the occupying forces, yet policymakers continued to prioritize diplomatic considerations over strategic reality. On the ground, the Third Army's reconnaissance teams observed the destruction of infrastructure, the removal of industrial assets, and the harsh treatment of civilians deemed politically unreliable. Cities that had just emerged from the crush of war were now being leveled, torn down, or lost. Remerged from the horrors of war, now faced a new, more insidious form of domination. Factories were dismantled and shipped eastward. Skilled labor was forcibly relocated, and political leaders who had resisted the new order were arrested or executed. The general's warnings about the consequences of allowing Eastern forces unchallenged access to these territories were coming true in real time. Despite this, American political leadership remained committed to a path of non-confrontation. Public opinion favored peace, and the horrors of the previous conflict had left society unwilling to engage in further military campaigns. The general's proposals for preemptive action, which relied on speed, morale, and the advantage of surprise, were dismissed as reckless. He had identified a fleeting moment when American forces held a decisive edge, but bureaucracy and caution ensured that opportunity was lost. The general continued to document every development, recording the occupation strategies and long-term intentions of the Eastern forces. He emphasized that the threat was not temporary. These armies were not merely seeking revenge or reparations, they were establishing a lasting influence over the region. His reports outlined the potential for extended conflict, the spread of authoritarian governance, and the challenges that would confront the United States and its allies in the coming decades. His meticulous records now serve as a testament to what military foresight had identified and what political hesitation had ignored. By the autumn of 1945, the scale of the occupation was undeniable. Key cities and industrial hubs were under firm control, and local populations were being reshaped to fit the new political ideology. Political opponents were systematically eliminated, while compliant leaders were installed to enforce the occupiers' directives. Even the most hardened veterans of the American forces were shocked by the methods and scope of the Eastern advance. The general's warnings, once dismissed as overly aggressive or politically naive, were now validated by the unfolding reality. Removed from command, the general's role shifted entirely to observation and reporting. Although he could no longer influence military operations, his insight remained invaluable. He warned of the growing threat of permanent occupation, the spread of authoritarian ideology, and the potential for conflict in Europe if these forces were left unchecked. His predictions about the escalation of tensions were accurate, yet the political system was ill-prepared to act on them. The gap between military reality and political strategy had widened, creating vulnerabilities that would shape global affairs for decades. This period underscored a fundamental lesson in the interplay between military strategy and political decision-making. Timing is critical. Opportunities for decisive action can vanish within weeks or months, and waiting for consensus can result in irrevocable consequences. The general's experience highlights the dangers of deferring action, the importance of recognizing emerging threats, and the cost of ignoring those who possess first-hand insight into the operational landscape. Ultimately, the events of 1945 revealed the tragic consequences of missed opportunities. The general's foresight had identified a clear, actionable path to limit the expansion of the Eastern forces and prevent the establishment of oppressive regimes. Yet political considerations, public fatigue, and the desire for immediate peace overrode strategic imperatives. The resulting occupation, the spread of authoritarian governments, and the onset of a prolonged geopolitical struggle became an inevitable outcome, confirming the general's analysis and emphasizing the enduring importance of aligning military insight with policy decisions. The general's death in December 1945 marked the end of a career defined by battlefield brilliance and strategic foresight. His passing, caused by a tragic accident, silenced the voice that had consistently warned of looming threats. Yet his predictions proved accurate. The territories he had observed were permanently occupied. Authoritarian regimes took root, and the balance of power in Europe shifted dramatically. The consequences of political inaction and the dismissal of military insight became painfully clear. Over the following decades, the scenario he had anticipated unfolded with tragic precision. Eastern territories remained under firm control, the spread of ideology continued, and countless lives were affected by policies and governance imposed from afar. Military analysts later confirmed that the general's assessment in 1945 had been sound. His understanding of the strength, morale, and intentions of occupying forces provided a window of opportunity for decisive action, a window that closed due to political hesitation and societal exhaustion. The lessons of his foresight were profound. Generals and strategists of later generations studied his reports to understand how a capable military mind had anticipated geopolitical shifts before they materialized. His work demonstrated that early recognition of emerging threats, combined with a willingness to act, can prevent long-term crises. Conversely, ignoring such warnings, even from the most credible sources, can lead to decades of conflict, occupation, and human suffering. In particular, his approach highlighted the importance of assessing enemy capabilities not only in terms of equipment and numbers, but also in terms of morale, logistics, and political constraints. He recognized that overwhelming force, when applied decisively and at the right moment, could have halted the expansion of authoritarian control. He also understood that strategic opportunities are fleeting. What could have been a swift, controlled action in 1945 became impossible once the occupying forces consolidated their positions. The general's insistence on speaking truth to power, regardless of political consequences, set a precedent for military ethics and leadership. He embodied the principle that the responsibility of commanders extends beyond immediate tactical concerns. They must also consider the long-term strategic landscape and communicate candid assessments, even when unpopular. His experience became a case study in the tension between military judgment and political decision-making, demonstrating how the suppression of insight can result in catastrophic outcomes. Even as history advanced, the echoes of 1945 influenced policy and strategy. Conflicts in Asia, Europe, and other regions reflected the very scenarios he had predicted: ideological expansion, the establishment of authoritarian regimes, and the challenges of countering such moves once they were entrenched. His warnings, initially ignored, were validated by subsequent events, reinforcing the value of military foresight and the cost of neglecting it. The general's life and career thus serve as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale. He exemplified the effectiveness of combining intelligence, operational planning, and strategic foresight. At the same time, his story highlights the limitations imposed by political considerations, public opinion, and bureaucratic inertia. Leaders who disregard the insights of those with direct knowledge and experience risk repeating historical mistakes, often with devastating consequences. Ultimately, the general's vision extended far beyond the immediate victories on the battlefield. He saw the broader arc of post-war power dynamics, identified threats before they became crises, and proposed solutions that, if implemented, could have altered the course of history. Though silenced too soon, his legacy endures as a testament to the enduring importance of courage, clarity, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Generations of military leaders, policymakers, and strategists have since grappled with the questions he raised. When should force be applied to prevent emerging threats? How should military judgment be weighed against political constraints? And what is the cost of ignoring those who see clearly what others cannot or will not acknowledge? His life was the answer. Speak the truth, act decisively when possible, and accept the personal and professional risks inherent in confronting inconvenient realities. In reflecting on 1945 and its aftermath, it becomes evident that opportunity and insight, if unheeded, may become a burden carried by those who follow. The general's warnings, ignored at the time, set the stage for decades of strategic challenges, shaping not only the Cold War but also the way nations evaluate and respond to emerging threats. His story remains a powerful reminder: the alignment of intelligence, strategy, and action is essential, and the consequences of failing to act decisively can echo across generations.